Good afternoon. It is 14:32 GMT on Sunday, the 23rd of August 2020. This is being recorded live from London, and we are featuring as the first item on display in this diagnosis, world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street. We are featuring the front page of the Sunday Mail on Sunday, which belongs to the same stable, the same publishing group as the Daily Mail, which has been running pictures of Boris Johnson caught glamping at a location in Scotland. And these are the two further pages 2 and 3 of the glamping Instagram. So there is no evidence on the front page of the Mail on Sunday or on pages 2 and 3 of any problem with the Boris Johnson government. In fact, they are fully behind the propaganda that the de facto, that is on the facts, in effect, they are saying that the coronavirus is no longer a problem, health problem, safety problem in this country, and that it is safe to go back to school. That is the public health or government's medical chief's advice. Now, this is a complete and utter falsehood, because in the inside pages of the Mail on Sunday, it is contradicting those propaganda lines, and the rest of the papers on Sunday are still absolutely not convinced that Britain is out of the pandemic. And it cannot be, because the European countries and other countries in other continents, North America and in Asia and in New Zealand and Australia, the cases of the virus spreading and surging, reviving, returning are being constantly reported. So, the Mail on Sunday is committing typical, corrupt, two-faced propaganda for Boris Johnson and his pandemonium of a government, while it is trying to tickle. And we have used the word tickle because that is exactly what they're doing. Tickle Boris Johnson and his conservative regime, to which the Mail on Sunday and the Daily Mail actually are absolutely ferociously committed. And there is this other two-page spread about drug taking in East London, on a canal boat in East London, not far from the site of the 2012 Olympic overhyped games. And this is so they are actually aware of too many people flouting the rules against lockdown, and they're saying, with nightclubs closed, police are battling to stop hundreds of illegal rapes blamed for spreading the virus. Now, if the police are saying that they're struggling to stop people spreading the virus, then how is it the Main on Sunday can say that it is safe to go back to school? This is why we call this broadcast Diagnosing Fleet Street. That is examining the sickness afflicting this so-called street of the world's leading newspapers. Absolute rubbish. And Private Eye has been calling this street, the Fleet Street collectively, street of shame, because of the evidence, the newspapers in Fleet Street, or the English language newspapers based in London, London-centric because of the location, not because they represent the people of London, but they are geographically located in London, and they are part of an addendum of the establishment identifiable by reference to the word Westminster. That is a reference to the Palace of Westminster, where the main houses of Parliament are located. Although they have got annexes and extensions, it's the main building that is recognized as the center of the British Parliament. And the British Parliament is complete joke, as the behavior of Boris Johnson in stuffing the upper house with cronies and crooks illustrates. Successive conservative governments in this country have stuffed the so-called upper house with cronies and crooks and criminals. And the only criteria for putting them in the House of Peers has been the peers' depth of involvement in funding the corrupt Conservative Party. Contrasting with Boris Johnson's stuffing of the House of Peers is, of course, the incident where the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson was pilloried and destructively condemned for allowing a number of persons to become members of the House of Peers, because it was alleged Harold Wilson took the advice of his political aide, Marcia Williams. And because of that, Wilson was never forgiven by the Fleet Street mafia, who practically treated him as a criminal for doing that. Whereas, since Harold Wilson's so-called lavender list, because the list of persons that Harold Wilson nominated for the peerages, the nomination procedure involved the list being given to the monarch, who is the same monarch, Brenda, that is Queen Elizabeth II. So that list was written on a piece of lavender paper in a toilet or whatever, and that is why Wilson was condemned forever for the lavender list and the peerages. At least 100 times the number of the lavender listed peers of Harold Wilson's particular core list, a handful actually. So 100 times that number have been pushed into the House of Peers by Conservatives in the decades since Harold Wilson did that. And none of the newspapers in Fleet Street, including The Guardian, has been doing anything like the comparable outcry or even noticing the corruption by the Conservative prime ministers since Harold Wilson. And so it is outrageous and completely corrupt. Newspapers are still being cited by the BBC to the rest of the world as the voice of independent journalism. Total, utter, absolute rubbish. And the failure of Fleet Street to tell the truth and tell the truth about health, about education, about poverty, about hunger, about famine, about human rights actually affects lives literally. So that is why it's important. And the Mail on Sunday is continuing the job as propaganda organ for the anti-migrant racist hysteria. This 28-year-old person, I mean, they're saying that he's 28-year-old, he could be 16-year-old according to earlier reports, but whatever the age, he's a young person from Sudan or Sudanese young person. Abdul Fattah Hamdallah, that lost his life trying to cross the channel into England. And as we said, there is absolutely clear evidence of a link between poverty, between lack of civil liberties, between lack of social kind of security, lack of personal security, civil liberties in Sudan, that forced him and hundreds or thousands of others to want to leave their country in search of a place where they could have a life, basic human life, human rights. And there is nothing in this piece which says, drowned migrants' friends, we won't stop trying to get to the UK. That is a threatening headline, threatening to the people that are the ordinary readers of the Mail on Sunday. And it's the gullible people that are being hoodwinked into believing that hordes of the likes of him are poised to jump into the channel and cross into England and take over England. That is complete rubbish. That is not going to happen. It has never been allowed to happen because there are so many obstacles created by the successive regimes in government in the UK, whatever political color, that prevents people like this victim from crossing safely and freely and without intimidation or harassment into England. Once in England, of course, all the fantasies, all the imaginations, and all the imagined safety and security are shattered by the reality that face them and greet them. And the hostile environment about the Windrush generation that Theresa May was kind of identified as a result of a report about the Home Office operating hostile environment under her tenure as the Home Secretary or the Interior Minister from 2010 onwards until she became successor to David Cameron, following Cameron's politically suicidal, idiotic stunt holding the Brexiteering nightmarish referendum. So the hostile environment has been very much a key obstruction to victims of human rights violations, victims of famine, starvation, hunger, and other threats and denials of human rights from seeking asylum in Britain. Now that is very significant because those obstructions have been put in place and operated by violating the legal international treaty and charter and convention obligations owed by Britain as a member state. As a member state of the United Nations, as a member state of the then European Union, and as a member state, signatory state to other international treaties and charters, upholding the rights of these people and guaranteeing them safety. So no one looking at the outcry in Kent County Council and in the Daily Express and the Daily Mail and the Sun during the last fortnight would have assumed, even imagined, that there were these treaty obligations that Britain was violating, and these papers and these media organs were aiding and abetting in the violation of. Now extrapolate that pattern, that tendency, that propensity on the part of the media to collude in the violation of the treaty and international charter convention obligations. Extrapolate that series of violations that affect mainly non-British people, people coming from abroad, coming from originating countries where famine, genocide, warfare, and hunger and starvation dominate the landscape. Extrapolate that propensity, transfer that pattern onto the British government's behavior against British people in British soil. And you can find the same kind of contempt for the legal duties owed to the people in Britain by the British government. And the Fleet Street papers, including the Mail and Sunday, are absolutely deafeningly silent on these breaches. And that is where I say the real causes of preventable housing crisis, preventable poverty, preventable lack of human rights within the UK and at the expense of British people in Britain, that is where they lie. And people like these ones, they don't represent absolutely, they don't represent the majority of the ordinary people. These are the minority. So the ordinary people who are following the rules, abiding by the rules, and are respecting their duties, they are not recognized by the government, they are not recognized by the papers and the media and the Fleet Street. They are not given any thanks for complying with the requirement for safety. And they're not given credit for helping. They're not given credit for helping prevent the pandemonium government from collapsing completely. And there is this kind of token exception from the norm of the ordinary line followed by the Mail on Sunday and the Daily Mail group, which is the column given to Peter Hitchens. And he's given us that in a typically, quote, British, patronizing, dishonest, cynical way as an eccentric. So he says, were holiday wrecking quarantines worth it? And his answer is, they haven't a clue. Now, Hitchens is one of those people who kind of has a go at the establishment, which patronizes him in effect, and kind of tickles them. He tickles them in a way that he has got the license to do, just like Janet Street Porter does, tickle them. And they tickle them on license. I mean, they are given platforms precisely because they will be performing that tickling job, which means that they are not really challenging the corruption, the lie, the deception, the dishonesty by the establishment at any point, at any level. And the Mail on Sunday is the classic kind of brand leader of the ticklers. I mean, the Mail on Sunday itself is a tickler, as we have shown. The front page, pages 2 and 3, are devoted to promoting the lie that the virus is gone, whereas inside pages are full of various reports and accounts and evidence that the virus is far from over and it's dangerous, and even the police are struggling to control the illegal ravers indulging in their excessive violence towards the duties, if you like, and violations of the rules, as they were caught doing so on the canal not far from the Stratford Olympic Park. And what is happening in the Mail on Sunday's coverage is actually a cover-up of the failures of the Boris Johnson-fronted regime. And there is no evidence that the Mail on Sunday is bothered about the victims of the failures, including, there is nothing in the Mail on Sunday about the evictions. There is no issue about housing, the lack of housing and human rights. And as we said in the Saturday's papers, the same. Moving on to the other side of the spectrum, as it were, within the false, kind of falsely constructed metrics in the narrow street of Fleet Street, or the narrow world of Fleet Street, which is essentially two sides of the same corrupt establishment. And the Observer runs with the kind of token tickler. I mean, this is the official tickler, Starmer. He tickles Boris Johnson. He says, your chaos puts schools' return at risk. Now, the presumption is not against Boris Johnson's policy. The presumption is that Boris Johnson is not taking all the steps he should take to do the wrong thing. Starmer is very much part of the agenda that Boris Johnson is fronting. So Starmer is not opposing. Starmer is saying that Boris Johnson needs to be more careful and less chaotic in order to do the wrong thing. That is to expose the hundreds of thousands of school children to infection, to virus infection, against the advice of the parents, advice of the teachers, advice of the teachers' unions, advice of the majority of people who know how this thing is working against public health and public safety. So the Observer, supposed to be at the opposite end of the so-called divide, right and left in the Fleet Street kind of division politically and alliances and allegiances. The Observer is actually on the same side as Boris Johnson, as is Keir Starmer. And on the inside page, there is a rare piece in this, that there is a piece about the destruction of the ice in the last 30 years. It is saying that the Earth lost 28 trillion tons of ice in less than 30 years. This is the stark reality that is physically destroying the Earth. The planet is heating up and it's going to be exploding, literally exploding in heat. And millions, hundreds of millions of people are going to die. Hundreds of millions and billions of animals are going to die. This is not what the details of the piece is actually saying in these words, but that is what is going to happen. And the observer is focusing on Gavin Williamson. The observer is not focusing on Boris Johnson. So the planet is going to explode, it's burning, it's going to burn. And the governments, fronted by Donald Trump and others, are in brazen denial. They don't care. So they're destroying the planet. It's not just one group of people, one ethnic group, or one political group, or one social group. It's the entire humanity that is being completely sacrificed. That is what is happening. But they are not treating this as page one issue. And the observer on pages 6 and 7 is running 2 pages of reporting about the COVID crisis. And the second page, it is saying, why do fatalities remain low when infection numbers are rising? That's a very important factual evidential question. And they're talking about Birmingham, fear and fatalism, a second city watches surge in COVID cases. So the evidence is that the pandemic is very much active and infecting people. And there is no evidence that the government has a clue, which is the exact sentiment expressed in that headline to Peter Hitchens's piece in the Mail on Sunday. And on the page 10, the observer is following up on the racist and false scare spread by Nigel Farage about a hotel in Essex where exhausted migrants have been housed, but they have been blamed for, completely falsely, a wave of crime, new crime, and the crimes have been linked by local people to the arrival of the migrants at this hotel, which is completely wrong. Now, although the Observer is running it, the main newspaper coverage has been completely, absolutely not bothered about this, that the migrants were the victims of so many of the losses of rights as human beings desperate people, they are being blamed for a crime wave that is not there. And even if there are criminals doing their crimes, it's nothing to do with the migrants. But they are being blamed for it, which is what for many years was done against migrants in the coastal areas of Kent. And even people like the so-called moderate Tory, Amber Rudd was actually party to spreading kind of false allegations against people arriving on the coastal areas from other parts of the country, mainly poor people, people on benefit, she actually said. Now, here is the two-page spread on pages 14 and 15 about the eviction. And she's saying that eviction ban was not enough to keep people off the streets because tenants have been being evicted during the lockdown. When the ban on eviction proceedings has been allegedly in place. So that is the extent to which the propaganda that the Conservatives, and especially in this case the Minister at the expense of housing, is caring about the safety and protection of people under threat of eviction, under threat of losing their homes. That is absolutely exposed as a sham. And the Labour Party has not actually done its duty to pinpoint and point out this on a daily basis or even on a weekly basis. And even after last week's staged extension of the ban up to 20th of September, the Labour Party has not followed up with the evidential rebuttal that it can and should and must actually rebut the lies attaching to the promotion of the line that the eviction ban on proceedings has been extended. And that actually includes the behavior and the role of the local councils, most of which in the affected areas are controlled by the Labour Party card-carrying members as councillors and executive mayors, and the main court system. The magistrates courts and the county courts, where the majority of the applications are processed, they are not fairly heard, not fairly from the standpoint of the victims of eviction proceedings. These courts and the judges and the magistrates, essentially the absolute majority of them, are prejudiced and biased against the tenants, against the victims of the eviction proceedings. And there is a piece here on the Observer, page 20, promoting the leadership of Keir Starmer, where the exam fiasco, as they're calling it, by Gavin Williamson and Boris Johnson's cabinet minister at the expense of education. The Labour Party under Keir Starmer is busy refining its social media propaganda skills. Now, that is nothing to do with the actual crisis that plagues the education industry in this country, which is corruption. A to Z of the education industry is corrupt, dishonest. And this algorithm-linked exposure of the conservative regime's corruption in robbing the grades of the children is a tip of the iceberg, and there is no evidence that the Labour Party is even aware of the extent of the corruption in the education sector. just like the Labour Party is not engaging in addressing the central corruption of the underlying the housing crisis, the eviction pandemic, and the virus of lies by the profiteers and landlords. And there is a rare piece again here on page 24 of the Observer about the Uyghur Muslims being abused and their human rights violated, because the tactic that the Chinese regime uses to hide the suppression of the rights of the Uyghur Muslims is by organizing press trips. It says the heavily supervised visits to indoctrination centers present reporters with smiling inmates and tales of cultural acceptance. There's brainwashing the Muslims in China, in the Uyghur region, to such an extent that it has got literally thousands of smiling Muslims posing for visiting journalists, organized trips, and then hiding the actual extent and the fact of the violations of human rights that even they are under, the smiling ones are under, but not for the duration of the visits that last a few hours. So we are talking about the Fleet Street on Sunday, and in the context of the housing crisis, in the context of the racist crisis created by the hysteria against the migrants and the abuse of positions by Boris Johnson and his cabinet members across the board in failing the health service, in failing the care service, in failing the people in low income and in no income. And the agenda of the Sunday Times, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Sun newspaper, which gave him the real kind of income which made him the billionaire, which allowed him to go to the USA and take over Fox News and other American networks. It all happened in Tower Hamlets in Wapping for decades. Murdoch made most of his money from a place in Tower Hamlets. Amazing. Tower Hamlets remains on the official list as being one of the poorest boroughs in England. And here is the richest billionaire media owner who robbed the public via the semi-pornographic Sun on page 3 and became a billionaire, which billions he used to take over other powerful organs of the media in the USA and consolidate his control and ownership and power in Britain and in the British media, and his ownership of the government, whatever color the government was. Except when Gordon Brown became leader of the Labour Party, he stopped supporting the Labour Party government. But until Blair was out of the post, Murdoch owned Blair's government as he owned the previous governments of the Conservatives. And we are looking at the papers to see what evidence there is of any connection by these journalists, so-called, with the reality of life as experienced by poor people, people facing loss of housing, and people facing another surge, another return of the pandemic because of the government's policy of hard immunity, which is to let as many people get infected as possible. And miraculously, that wider infection will make them immune. Completely illogical and completely unfounded scientifically. and completely consistent with the policy of neglect to the ordinary people by the government. And this government has the audacity to say that a lone migrant, like the 28-year-old who died, the Sudanese 28-year-old, poses a threat to the safety and security of the entire British population. Whereas the British government is committing mass murders under covers of the pandemic, as wsws.org website has been claiming. This is evident in front of the Guardian, in front of the Observer, but they're not saying it, in front of Keir Starmer, but he's not saying it. We shall continue the diagnosis in the next edition.